Brian especially seemed vulnerable to the temptations of life in the fast lane. With less say in the direction and management of the band, he channeled his restless energies into fleshing out the Rolling Stone fantasy. It's been said that Brian actually lived the things that Mick merely sang about. His early experimentation with drugs and liaisons with groupies were legendary. Yet not all of the Stones brought the job home with them. Both Wyman and Watts tended to shun the social spotlight, preferring the privacy of a quiet family life. At the time, Brian was dating the beautiful jet-set actress Anita Pallenberg. Their flame burned brightly until 1967, when Anita and Keith began their own long association. Mick's view on marriage was similar to Brian's. Jagger had dated London socialite Chrissy Shrimpton, but broke off their romance when he became infatuated with the wide-eyed innocence of Marianne Faithfull. Marianne was Andrew Oldham's most remarkable discovery outside of the Stones. Her rendition of Mick and Keith's As Tears Go By catapulted her to pop stardom. Initially offended by the Stones, she soon became infatuated with Mick. They both openly scorned the idea of marriage and remained one of swinging London's most celebrated couples throughout the 1960s. But the restraining nature of their relationship caused Faithfull to wind up addicted to drugs. In the last 2 years of their relationship, Marianne suffered a miscarriage, a near-fatal overdose, and a failed attempt at a pop career comeback. In 1971, Mick would jolt the rock world by marrying Bianca. The wedding itself was a media circus, and the marriage only made it 5 years. Most of it played out in the gossip pages around the world. The Rolling Stones' personal problems weren't limited to women, however. Mick, Keith, and Brian were in and out of court on various drug charges all through the late 60s. Many of the allegations were obviously trumped up, and occasionally based on planted evidence. Despite their personal problems, the Stones rolled on. In many ways, their troubles provided raw material for their music. During the remainder of the 60s, the Stones recorded some of the most exciting rock and roll ever put down on tape. At times, they seemed to follow the Beatles' example in exploring new musical directions. At other times, their own genius at creating driving R&B pop classics would take the lead. The Stones had already released a greatest hits compilation before their first real landmark album was even recorded. That LP was Aftermath, released in 1966. It was the first Stones LP to consist solely of Jagger Richards originals. After a couple of lesser follow-ups and a foray into the cosmic, which was intended as the Stones' answer to the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album, the band regrouped, determined to re-establish themselves as the greatest rock and roll band in the world. Andrew Oldham, their longtime producer and manager, was fired before the Stones returned to the recording studio and laid down what several of the group considered to be the best Rolling Stones album ever, Beggar's Banquet. With Jagger involved with his movies in the summer of '69, it appeared the group might be splintering apart. On June 8th, Brian Jones announced he was quitting the band. 20-year-old virtuoso guitarist Mick Taylor was named to replace him, and the new Rolling Stones lineup was scheduled to debut on July 5th at a free concert in Hyde Park. But 2 days before the show, Brian Jones died, his reckless, hedonistic lifestyle finally catching up with him. Fans around the world were devastated at the news. But the July 5th Stones concert in the park went on as scheduled, only as a tribute to Brian. With the Hyde Park concert under their belts, the Rolling Stones felt confidence in embarking on their first U.S. tour since mid-1966. The tour was intended to promote the release of their latest album, Let It Bleed. But with the final performance, a free concert at Altamont, it came to represent the end of the 60s. During that infamous concert, the Hells Angels beat a man to death, and 3 others died from various accidents. As the 1970s dawned, the Rolling Stones awoke to find that they had survived the 60s. The new decade would find the Stones actually getting bigger and bigger. Their musical skills grew even further. Their sellout stadium concerts were exciting, elaborately choreographed shows, and their records were all bestsellers. In 1971, Sticky Fingers became the band's first platinum LP, selling over 1 million copies in the U.S. The logo for the group's new record label offended some, as did the Sticky Fingers zippered jacket, which was designed by Andy Warhol. So for the conservative Spanish market, a special sleeve was printed. Subsequent albums varied in quality, though each generally contained one or two instant classics. But with the group living abroad as tax exiles, it sometimes took a year or more to record each LP. Quite a change from their first record, which was taped in a single-day session. In 1975, Mick Taylor surprised everyone by announcing he was quitting the band to form one of his own. Recording sessions for the Black and Blue album were about to commence, but the Stones didn't rush into finding a replacement. They eventually hired Ron Wood, who was still officially a member of the Faces, and only on loan to the Stones. But when Rod Stewart left the Faces for a solo career, Wood also bowed out to become a full-time Rolling Stone. The new guitarist looked and acted like he was one of the originals during the Stones tour of the Americas in 1975. That 3-month marathon was kicked off with a surprise performance in the streets of New York on the back of a flatbed truck. By this time, some rock fans began to feel that the Rolling Stones were fun, but that they just didn't matter as a musical force anymore. For their part, the Stones just worked harder at trying to be outrageous, to capture that old rebel image. Then, with the release of Some Girls in 1978, it was evident that the Stones could still muster a great album. Emotional Rescue ushered in the 1980s. That album stayed at #1 longer than any previous Stones record. As the group approached its 20th anniversary, Bill Wyman vowed to quit. He had already recorded 2 solo albums in the mid-70s and wanted to pursue other things. But then Mick Jagger had vowed to quit when he turned 30. Wyman, too, backed down from his promise. The Stones' most lucrative tours ever followed. Studio albums became more sporadic, but managed to create great excitement with each release. Despite the well-publicized animosity which had grown between Mick and Keith, and statements and rumors that the band had broken up, the Rolling Stones seemed to keep coming back. Whether or not the band continues touring or recording makes little difference to the Rolling Stone legend. It was cast in stone years ago. The band's influence as a mover of cultural and musical style may have passed with the 60s, but their great accomplishments still reverberate through society, making it unlikely there will ever be another group that can lay claim to the title of the greatest rock and roll band in the world.